Night had already wrapped the road in thick darkness, yet I kept speeding forward through the inky void, illuminated only by the headlights of my truck. On both sides of the highway stretched dead forests, and I caught myself struggling to keep my eyes open. But I didn't want to stop. The sooner I got there, the better. Suddenly, a dimly lit sign of an old roadside cafe appeared ahead. To be honest, it looked as if its last visitor had stopped by 20 years ago. Peeling paint, a rusty sign, but the lights were on, which meant it was open. An inner voice told me I should just keep driving, but exhaustion won out. I pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine, and climbed out of the cab, feeling the cool night air brush against my face. As I stepped inside the cafe, the first thing that struck me was the emptiness. No one was there. Just one man sitting at a table in the far corner, old, with gray hair and deep wrinkles that looked as if they had been carved with a knife. He wore a worn leather jacket and seemed like he belonged to another time, almost as if he were a part of this forgotten roadside diner. He raised his gaze to me and gave a slight nod. I walked to the counter, ordered a strong tea, and picking up my cup, slowly made my way toward the old man. There was something strange in his eyes, but I couldn't look away. I sat down across from him, nodded in greeting, and he studied me with a long, intent stare. "Long road ahead?" he asked, his voice carrying the rustle of age and weariness. "Headed to Seattle," I replied. The old man nodded, muttered something to himself, then leaned in slightly, and almost in a whisper said, "You know, kid, these roads, they're not for the weak. I've seen a lot, too much, and back in my younger years, I went through something that still keeps me up at night." Something in his words hooked me. His voice trembled, and his eyes looked empty, like the road itself, as if he were tied to it, like an old tree to its roots. I sipped my tea, feeling the exhaustion ease a little, and nodded to the old man to show I was listening. For a long time, he was silent, glancing toward the windows, as if making sure no one outside was eavesdropping. Then he began to speak. "It was back in 1980. I was on the road, rushing with a load. The night was as dark as this one, and the empty highway led me through an endless forest. No one around, just my headlights, the shining lines on the road, and the hum of the engine." The old man paused for a moment, staring into the space before him, as if he were reliving those events. So I'm driving, not thinking about anything bad. Then, up ahead on the shoulder, I see someone standing there. At first, I couldn't make out who it was, but I slowed down anyway. Figured maybe it was a hitchhiker. It happens. Truckers help each other out. As I drove a little closer, I realized something was off. A man stood there wearing a long old coat, but I couldn't see his face. The headlights illuminated him in a strange way, almost as if he had no face at all. That caught my attention. The old man's words, though strange, sounded too real. It was as if I had been transported to that dark highway myself, feeling cold sweat on my palms. The old man continued, gripping his cup with slightly trembling hands. So, he's standing there, right on the roadside with his hand raised like a hitchhiker. I hit the brakes, rolled down the window, and asked where he was headed. He didn't answer, just stared at me. And the way he looked, it sent chills down my spine. But I figured I was just tired. Maybe the guy was in shock, who knows? So I invited him into the cab, told him, "Hop in, I'll take you to the nearest town." The old man paused, as if recalling the eerie silence that had hung over the road. He got in, shut the door, and we drove on. I kept trying to make conversation, asked him where he was coming from, where he was going, but he stayed silent, just staring straight ahead. We drove like that for a long time. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. I started thinking maybe he'd fallen asleep, when suddenly, in a quiet, barely audible voice, he said, "You're dead too, aren't you? Just like me." The old man fell silent, lowering his head. Something inside me twisted at his words. A chill ran down my spine. The man let out a quiet sigh, and for a moment, something painful flickered in his eyes, as if he were reliving that moment all over again. Those words, they pierced right through me. "You're dead too, aren't you?" he repeated. But his voice, it had changed. It sounded distant, unnatural. I turned to look at him, and that's when I noticed. His face was changing, blurring, losing its human features. I tried to focus on the road, to keep my eyes off him, but in the side mirror, I saw his head begin to tilt, slowly, unnaturally, as if his bones had stopped holding it up. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I gripped the wheel. My hands were slick with sweat, but I didn't dare move. I was too afraid to look at him. The old man let out a heavy sigh, as if struggling against the weight of his memories. I kept driving, and he just sat there, staring at me with those dark eyes. Then suddenly, in a voice completely different from before, he said, "All roads lead here. Don't try to escape." And that's when I realized I couldn't stop. My feet felt glued to the pedals. I tried to slow down, but the truck wouldn't listen. It just kept going, faster and faster. The old man exhaled deeply, as if relieved to finally speak the words out loud. It was like he was trying to free himself from the burden of his secret. He spoke again, and his voice grew louder and louder, until it became a deafening roar. "Do you know what it means to die? When your heart is still beating?" he said, looking at me. His own eyes had become dull, lifeless. And once again, he stared straight ahead, unblinking. He was seeing something I couldn't, and that something terrified me more than anything. I felt a cold, inexplicable chill creeping under my skin. I tried to speak, but my voice was gone. Then he said, "You'll find out soon. Everyone does, sooner or later." The old man stopped. I saw his hands clench, his knuckles turning white. Then suddenly, he lowered his head as if unsure whether to continue. He just disappeared. The old man looked at me, his eyes filled with exhaustion and pain. "Just disappeared," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. I was driving down the highway, staring into the emptiness ahead, and then I realized he wasn't there anymore. No sound of the door opening, no footsteps. He was just gone. The cab was empty, as if no one had ever been there. I froze, not knowing what to say. He continued. My hands were shaking. My eyes felt like they were about to pop out of my head from fear. I didn't know whether to stop or keep going. But the worst part? When I looked in the mirror, on the back seat, where he had been sitting, there was an imprint, like something had sunk into the upholstery. It was damp, dark, like fresh blood. I swerved onto the shoulder and jumped out of the cab. Took a few steps back, trying to catch my breath, but I just couldn't calm down. Finally, I gathered the courage to look inside again. The seat was clean, no stains, no marks, and the cab was empty, as if no one had ever been there. A ghost, maybe? The man fell silent before continuing. Since then, no matter how far I go, he still comes back sometimes. Every time I get into the cab, I see him again in the side mirror, standing on the roadside, raising his hand like a hitchhiker, turning away, never looking at me. But I know he's there. I know he's watching me. One time wasn't enough for him. The old man looked at me, and in his gaze, I saw something deep, indescribable, like an abyss. And that's when I realized he cursed me. He said, "All roads lead here." Now I can't leave this highway. Every time I try to take another road, he comes back. And each time, he's closer, like he's waiting for me to become just like him. He fell silent, staring into his cup as if speaking only to himself. I sat there, trapped in his story, feeling my heart turn cold inside my chest. Suddenly, the old man stood up, nodded at me as if saying goodbye, and walked toward the door without looking back. I remained seated, feeling the air grow heavier, thick with his story. Finishing my tea, I decided it was time to leave. I got up and headed for the exit. When I stepped into the parking lot, I turned to glance back at the cafe, searching for the old man. But there was no one. Nothing. Not a single trace. No cars, no trucks. Only my lone truck sat in that empty lot. It was as if the old man had never existed at all.